Well, brothers and sisters, we've now come to an unfortunate part of the subject matter of the Tabernacle of David, and it is inextricably linked with what we have been considering in our first two studies. This is a disastrous chapter for David. It's probably taking place about 30 years after he brought the ark to Zion. We know that the record is towards the end of his life, so we're estimating about 30 years later. And unfortunately, David had forgotten what he had done when he brought the ark to Zion. And of course, this chapter begins clearly telling us that there was a time in Israel when things had slackened off to a point that God wanted to put a bomb under them. He wanted to somehow regenerate in this nation more faithfulness than was existent at the time. And that's why we read in verse 1 that Satan, who we know from 2 Samuel 24 verse 1 is Yahweh himself, right? So the opposer, the adversary, stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. And so here we've got God putting a bomb under his nation, and he's going to do it through David's failure. His failure to remember what he had done in relation to the Gentiles when he brought the ark to Zion. And this is why 70,000 Israelites are going to die. Now we know, of course, that David was the one who understood the divine plan and purpose in relation to the Gentiles. And I want to take you to Romans chapter 15, if you wouldn't mind. Romans chapter 15, verses 8 and 9. Because here we have a series of passages that are quoted by the Apostle Paul that make it very plain what David understood. So in Romans chapter 15, verse 8, we read, "Now I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision," meaning the Jews, "for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, For this cause I will confess to thee among the Gentiles and sing unto thy name." So there's words quoted here from David, from Psalm 18 and verse 49. Now did you notice in verse 8 that we have basically verse 8 and 9, we have the two elements of Micah chapter 7 verse 20. They will perform the truth to Jacob and the mercy to Abraham. So you've got the truth to Jacob, which is, of course, the covenants of promise. But in those covenants of promise, there's the inclusion of the Gentiles. So the mercy to Abraham, that thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. And Psalm 18 verse 49, David sets forth his understanding that Gentiles would be included. And in fact, that psalm is really about Christ's victories in the future at Armageddon and beyond. And we read in verse 44, you read in verse 44 of that psalm, "The strangers shall submit themselves unto me." It's about Christ bringing the Gentiles under his power. The next quotation that the apostle makes is in verse 10 of Romans 15. "And again he saith, Rejoice ye Gentiles with his people." That's from Deuteronomy 32 and verse 43, which deals with Gentile conversion. He makes another quotation in verse 11. "And again, praise the Lord, all ye Gentiles, and laud him, all ye people." Now, this is from Psalm 117 and verse 1, which is the very centre of the Bible. And it uses in that particular psalm the two words that Yahweh uses of his own character, Kesed and Emeth, from Exodus 34 and verse 6. And then we have another quotation in verse 12 by the apostle. "And again Isaiah saith, There shall be a root of Jesse, and he that shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, in him shall the Gentiles trust." Isaiah 11 and verse 10, of course, speaks of the ultimate conversion of the nations. There was no one in Old Testament times who understood better than David that God was going to bring Gentiles into the process of salvation through the promises made to Abraham. And we've seen that in our first two studies very, very plainly. But David was like you and me, brothers and sisters. You know, as time passes on, you can forget. You can forget and you can get lax And that's what happens in the life of David, as we're going to see. So come back to 1 Chronicles 21. Let's consider what happens here in this chapter. Now, for a start, we've got to bat away some suggestions that have been made about this chapter. The numbering of Israel in this chapter, 1 Chronicles 21, was it a mistake or was it otherwise? It has been suggested that David did not err in numbering Israel, for he sought only to collect money for the building of the temple. Well, I don't hardly need to say that there's silence about the collection of the half shekel of the sanctuary in the story, but that's the suggestion that's made. It's also suggested that Israel were punished by Yahweh for their apathy and disinterest in the project of building the temple. It is postulated that David was correct and that Joab was wrong in opposing the numbering of Israel. Is this right? I mean, is this idea that's been suggested correct? Well, it's not correct. Now, one of the passages that's taken by folk who suggest this is 1 Kings 15 and verse 5, which says, it's a summary of David's life. Because David did that which was right in the eyes of Yahweh and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. So they say, well, look, there's no mention there of David numbering Israel. So therefore, you see, they don't classify it as being a sin or a problem. The reason why the matter of Uriah and Bathsheba is introduced here is what we read in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 14 from the mouth of Nathan the prophet, who came to David. By this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of Yahweh to blaspheme God's name. That was the reason why this is highlighted. That didn't happen in the numbering of Israel. What it did, though, was to go back on what David understood in relation to the Gentiles. Anyway, who sinned here? David or Israel? 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1, Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel, would suggest that Israel needed to be corrected. In 2 Samuel 24 verse 1, which is the companion account we read, and again the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. So Israel was unquestionably deserving of punishment. But was David free of error in numbering them? Well, no, he wasn't. 1 Chronicles chapter 27, verses 23 and 24 make this point. But David took not the number of them from 20 years old and under, because Yahweh had said he would increase Israel like to the stars of the heaven. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, began to number, but he finished not, because there fell wrath for it against Israel. Neither was the number put in the account of the Chronicles of King David. Now, we wouldn't have a record like that if this numbering was right. You would have kept the number, etc. It wasn't right. It was wrong. It was done for the wrong reasons. And David acknowledged his mistake. Here in this chapter that we read, in verse 17, we read these words. And David said unto God, is it not I that commanded the people to be numbered? Even I it is that have sinned and done evil indeed. But as for these sheep, what have they done? So David ascribes the problem to himself, to his decision to number Israel. In 2 Samuel 24 verse 10, the companion account we read, and David's heart smote him after that he had numbered the people. And David said unto Yahweh, I have sinned greatly in that I have done. And now I beseech thee, O Yahweh, take away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. So I think we get a bit of an idea. This was a serious mistake by David. It was a sin against Yahweh. And of course it was used to give a thrashing to Israel, to put a bomb under them, to get them going again. So what was David's mistake? What do you think? What was the real mistake? The numbering of Israel, just to know their number, was forbidden. In Exodus 30 verses 12 to 14, if you want to number Israel in a census, you did it for one reason. Not to know how many men you had to fight wars. That was not the reason you did it. You did it for one reason, and that was to collect the half shekel of the sanctuary. And that half shekel of the sanctuary was to be paid by rich and poor. It didn't matter how wealthy you were or how poor you were. You all paid the half shekel of the sanctuary. It was silver. And silver, of course, is the biblical symbol for redemption. And what God was saying to his people, I don't care who you are, you all need redemption. So you'll all pay the half shekel, rich or poor, because you all need redemption. That's why a census was taken. Numbering the tribes of Israel and omitting the Gentile converts in the land was David's greatest mistake. Did you notice in 1 Chronicles 21 and at verse 6 that Job's numbering was perfunctory? Have a look at verse 6 of 1 Chronicles 21. But Levi and Benjamin counted he not among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab. Well, if he didn't count the Levites or the men of Benjamin, do you reckon he counted the Gentiles that were scattered throughout Israel? No. He left the Gentiles out. And because he did not include the Gentiles, 70,000 Israelites are going to die. You see, he had gone back on his understanding of what he had done 30 years before, when he had included the Gentiles, operated as a Melchizedek king priest and brought out bread and wine. He'd gone back on that. And God says, you got that wrong, David. You've got that seriously wrong. Now, if there's anybody in this room who doubts that this is correct, then just hold your horses, because we'll nail this down so hard you won't get it off the ground. Okay? We'll show you scripturally that this is exactly what happened. He went back on his original understanding of the inclusion of the Gentiles. Hence, what was the punishment? The loss of 70,000 Israelites in verse 14. So Yahweh sent pestilence upon Israel, and there fell of Israel 70,000 men. Now 70 is the number of the Gentiles, or the number of the nations. And I guess some of you have done the exercise in Genesis chapter 10. And you've based that exercise on Deuteronomy 32 verse 8. And that verse says this: when the Most High separated to the sons of Adam, and he divided up the nations at the time of the rebellion of Nimrod, when he confused their tongues in Genesis chapter 11, the outcome of that was 70 different nations, 70 different tongues. And if you've done the exercise in Genesis chapter 10, how many of you have done that actually? Anybody here done the exercise of counting the names in Genesis chapter 10? I make that challenge to people because I want you to do it. And when you do it, you're going to find... Let's go back and have a look at it very briefly. Keep your hand, if you can, in 1 Chronicles 21. Come back to Genesis 10 briefly. I made this challenge on several occasions, and I've had brethren who've gone away and done the exercise. And they've come back and said, I found 71. All right? And I knew they'd come back and tell me they'd found 71. I was ready for them. You see, between verse 2 and verse 5, we have 14 nations from Japheth. Between verse 6 and verse 20, we have 30 nations from Ham. Between verse 21 to the end of the chapter, we have 26 nations from Shem. Now, if you add them up, that's 70. But when you do the count to check out that I've got this right, you'll say, well, no, I counted 71. That's because you counted a name that's not the name of a man. And that's in verse 11 of Genesis chapter 10. It says this: out of that land went forth Asher. Now, it sounds like Asher is a man. It isn't. That should be rendered, as the margin would suggest, he, namely Nimrod, went forth out of the area of Babylon, okay? He went forth to Assyria. Or as the margin of my Bible says, he went out into Assyria and builded Nineveh and the city Rehoboth and Calah and Rezin, etc. So Nimrod was responsible for 2 mega cities. There was the one around Babylon where there were 4 cities, and they built a wall around them to encircle those cities so that no wild animals could get in. He did the same up at Nineveh. He had 4 towns, he built a wall. This is why when Jonah went there, it says that Nineveh was a city of 3 days' journey, 60 miles. Yeah, because you see it was 4 cities with a wall around them. It was a city of 60 miles across, 2 mega cities. So the Asher of verse 11 of Genesis 10 is not a man. It's the land of Assyria that's referred to. So you drop that one out, you get 70. So 70 is the number of the nations. And that's why Genesis 46 and verse 27 is significant. Because you know what it says? It says that when Jacob came into Egypt, he had 70 children and grandchildren. And Jacob, of course, is the name given. It's the natural name of Israel. It's the name given to him that is picked up by Gabriel. When he says to Mary, he says, he that's going to be born of you is going to reign over the house of Jacob. All right? The house of Jacob. And of his kingdom there shall be no end. I'm not talking about time. He's talking about extent. The kingdom of Christ will begin with Israel, but it won't end with Israel. It will embrace the whole world. Of his kingdom there will be no end. Okay, got the idea? That is what the name Jacob refers to. And if you want to just follow that up, jot down Psalm 59 verse 13 and have a crack at that one. Psalm 59 and verse 13. Anyway, it's also clear, isn't it, when you come to places like Exodus 15 and verse 27. When Israel came to Elim, the place of the mighty ones, they saw there a vision of the kingdom of God. What did they see? 12 palm trees, right? 12 wills and 70 palm trees. So 12 wills is the 12 wills of Israel, and of course the palm trees, the symbol of the nations. 70 nations surrounding the 12 wills of Israel. So what have we got here then in this number back in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 14? 70 is the number of the nations. When you come to the term thousand, to the Hebrew mind, that represents a family. Now again, proof. The proof is in Judges chapter 6 and verse 15. I'm just going to flick back there very quickly. Judges chapter 6, of course, is about Gideon. He's communing with Michael the archangel in this context. And this is what you read, that Gideon says to the angel in verse 15. And he said unto him, O my Lord, or as it should read, O Yahweh, because it was Michael, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. Now the word family in the Hebrew actually means thousand. It should be rendered, as Rotherham renders it, my thousand is the poorest in Manasseh. So you see, to a Hebrew, the father, Ab, or Abba, that's the first word, by the way, in the Hebrew dictionary, Ab, or Abba, father, a father has a family. And after 3 or 4 successive generations, he gets 1,000. So the 1,000 to a Hebrew mind represented a family. This is why the number 144,000 is so important. It's 12 times 12. And we know that 12 is the number of Israel. This is the perfect Israel. Why has it got 144,000? Well, it's a family. It's the divine family. So when we read of 70,000, what are we reading about? The family of the nations. And that's the exact number that God took out of Israel, because David didn't number the Gentiles. He left them out. So God says, righto, you leave out the Gentiles, then I'm going to take out of your people, the Jews, 70,000. That's what happened here, brothers and sisters. So it was a terrible, terrible judgment. And David realised he had made a silly, foolish mistake. Now, why did he make this mistake, do you think? Well, have a look with me at verses 1 to 4 of 1 Chronicles 21. Well, we read verse 1. Let's read verse 2. And David said to Joab and to the rulers of the people, Go number Israel from Beersheba even to Dan. How do you normally read of those two towns? In what order do they normally occur? Yeah, the other way around, isn't it? It's normally from Dan to Beersheba, isn't it? I wonder why the Spirit switches them around here. Well, you see, Beersheba was the place that was named by Abraham after he had made a covenant about the truth to a man called Abimelech, who was the king of the Philistines in Genesis 21. Genesis 21 is about the conversion of Gentiles. Abimelech and Abraham made a covenant, and there was 7 ewe lambs brought out, remember? And there was a well there, and they named the well Beersheba, the well of the 7 ewe lambs that were sacrificed, and 7, of course, is the covenant number. When you made a covenant, you either stated something 7 times, or you did what happened in Genesis 15. You had 7 pieces of animals and a bird, and you walked through them as Yahweh did. Or you did that, you had a calf. You divided the calf in 2, and you would walk through it, and you would state 7 times. And I'm going to keep this covenant. So 7 is the covenant number. So what we have here is this place named because of the conversion of Gentiles. All right? So Beersheba represents that. That's where Abraham went from when he took Isaac up to one of the hills of Moriah to show forth the sacrifice of Christ. He went from Beersheba, and guess where he returned to? In verse 19 of Genesis 22, he returned to Beersheba. So there's no doubting what Beersheba stands for. But what about Dan? Dan means judgment, doesn't it? So you see, even in that we have the cameo of the real issue of this chapter. The Gentiles were omitted from the numbering of Israel, and that ended up with judgment. That's why it says from Beersheba to Dan, and not from Dan to Beersheba, which it normally is in Scripture. I think you've got a bit of a feel for what's going on in this chapter. So David has to learn a lesson in Ornan's threshing floor. And guess who he is? He's a Gentile. And you know what happens here, brothers and sisters? The 3 days of pestilence with the angel of Yahweh destroying the people is stopped short. It stopped short of the full 3 days because the angel arrives at the threshing floor of a faithful Gentile. That's why God stops it short. And David's going to learn this lesson, that he'd left the Gentiles out. Now, Ornan signifies strong, according to Strong's Concordance, or light was perpetuated if you go to Brown Driver Briggs, based on Gesenius. But it's fascinating that this name occurs 12 times in Scripture. I wonder if that's an accident. 12 times the number of Israel, and 11 of those 12 occurrences are in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. You see, here was an Israelite indeed. He was a converted Gentile, and he had 4 converted faithful sons, as we're going to see. And that means there was 5 of them. And divine grace sees the angel that was destroying stop at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. His other name was Araunah, signifying joyful shouting of Yahweh, as we mentioned in our previous study. And that name occurs 9 times, and they're all in 2 Samuel chapter 24. He was a Jebusite, meaning trodden down. And of course he was there at a threshing floor. And that's what happens with threshing floors. They get trodden down because you're beating out the wheat, etc. And of course we know that that represents judgment. You know, the heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment, or threshing, as Joel chapter 3 says, is actually about judgment. He had 4 sons, which of course 4 is the number of a new creation developed through righteousness. It's about God manifestation. So you add their father to the 4 sons, you've got a total of 5, the number of divine grace. So divine judgment stops prematurely at the threshing floor of a faithful Gentile family. It's telling you something, isn't it? It's telling you that this judgment had come upon Israel because David had left the Gentiles out. That's the reason for it. So David was taught what he already knew. He was commanded to build an altar in Ornan's threshing floor on Mount Moriah. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1 tells us that that is where Solomon built his temple. There at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Then Solomon began to build the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem, it says, in Mount Moriah, where, and you'll notice that the words the Lord here are in italics. We're going to come back to this a little later on. See, they're in italics. They're not there in the text. It should read, where David saw Yahweh, or was seen of Yahweh, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. But we'll come back to that a little later on. Now, the fascinating thing about this is that David actually tried to go back to Gibeon. He was so disturbed by what was happening, because he knew that thousands of Israelites were being slain by the angel. And he makes his way out of the palace, and he's going north from his palace. In the city of David, he's going north. Guess where he comes to? The threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Guess who he sees there? He sees the angel with his sword drawn above the city. And he can't go to where he wants to go. So where does he want to go? Have a look at verses 29 and 30 of 1 Chronicles 21. And at that time, when David saw that Yahweh had answered him in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, then he sacrificed there. And then we're told this, that was not his intention. He wasn't intending to sacrifice at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He was intending to go to Gibeon. Look at the next verse, verse 30. But David could not go before it. We should read the balance. We should read verse 29. For the tabernacle of Yahweh which Moses made in the wilderness and the altar of the burnt offering were at that season in the high place at Gibeon. But, so when this verse begins with but, you know that he had a different intention than to sacrifice at the threshing floor of Ornan. What was his intention? But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid because of the sword of the angel of Yahweh. Now, I think we understand, David, brothers and sisters. How often is it that we get ourselves into a bind through our own stupidity? You know, when we forget the things that we should know, and we get ourselves into a bind, and we think, oh, what can I do about this? I'm going to buzz off here and buzz off there. And God's got to put roadblocks in front of you and say, look, you idiot, this is where I want you to be. That happens to me all the time. You might be different to me. But, you know, we get into a bind and we forget what we know. Well, that's what happens to David. And he wants to rush off to the tabernacle of Moses. Really, David? Come on, get your brain in, get it working. You included the Gentiles by not putting the ark in the tabernacle of Moses. You put it in your own tent so they could worship Yahweh. And you're going to go to the tabernacle of Moses to sort this out? Come on. You see, he's got to be brought back to his senses. He's got to be brought back to his understanding that God was going to redeem Gentiles. And it was foolish, first to number Israel, but it was even more foolish to leave out of that numbering the Gentiles. And so he's got to be corrected. And in the process, Israel has a bomb put under it as well. Marvellous the way God works, isn't it? David knew where Christ would be sacrificed. We saw that, didn't we? In 1 Samuel 17 verse 54, he takes the head of Goliath and he puts it outside the walls of Jerusalem because he knows that this is where Christ will be sacrificed. Golgotha. All right, he knew that from Genesis 22 verse 2. And he knew that the previous chapter, Genesis 21, was about the Gentiles being brought into the covenants of promise when Abraham made a covenant with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. You know, I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to take you back to Genesis 21. I want to show you something fantastic in Genesis 21. It's not part of this study, but let's do it. Let's go back to Genesis 21. I've got the nod from the man who's most important in this, sitting at the back there, that I can do it. You're going to give me an extra couple of minutes. Genesis chapter 21. Verse 22. And it came to pass at that time, what time? The time when Hagar and Ishmael are wandering aimlessly, cannot find the well around the wilderness. Because you see, Hagar and Ishmael have been put out of the house of Abraham. It's typical of the events of AD 70 when the Jews would be put out of the land and they'd wander aimlessly through the nations, couldn't find the well. The well of Beersheba, it was to be named. And then we find here that Abimelech comes out in verse 22. Came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore swear unto me here by God, that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness, to the chesed, the divine characteristic that I have done unto thee, that thou shalt do unto me, and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. By the way, that word swear, both in verse 23 and 24, is the Hebrew word shabah. You know what it means? To seven oneself. That's exactly what that Hebrew word means. To seven oneself. So you either made the oath, you said it 7 times, or you got out 7 ewe lambs, which is what Abraham does. And you sacrificed 7 ewe lambs to confirm the covenant. Now, we know that this was not about, as I said, setting up an ice cream parlour in the Negev. All right? This was not a business or commercial deal that was being done. It was about the truth. How do we know it's about the truth? Because it's quoted. It's quoted in Isaiah chapter 59 and verses 20 and 21. So come along to Isaiah. Don't lose Genesis 21, by the way. I've got to be dexterous. I've got 3 fingers in my Bible here. Isaiah chapter 59. Isaiah 59 verse 20. And the Redeemer shall come to Zion. No doubt about who that's speaking of. The Redeemer shall come to Zion, and unto them that turn from transgression in Jacob saith Yahweh. As for me, that's straight out of Genesis chapter 17 verse 4. So it's the Abrahamic promises that are in mind. As for me, it's exactly what God said to Abraham. As for me, this is my covenant with them, saith Yahweh. My spirit that is upon thee, and my words which I have put in thy mouth, shall not depart out of thy mouth, nor out of the mouth of thy seed, nor out of the mouth of thy seed. Does that remind you of something? That's Genesis 21 verse 23. But one thing I didn't tell you. You know what I didn't tell you? When Abimelech came to Abraham, he didn't come alone. He came with a man who's called his chief captain. You know what his name means? His name is Phicol. His name means the mouth of all. Yeah, that's what it means. The mouth of all. So he represents, brothers and sisters, you and me. See what it says here? My spirit that is upon thee, and my words which I have put in thy mouth shall not depart out of thy mouth, nor out of the mouth of thy seed, nor out of the mouth of thy seed, saith Yahweh, from henceforth and forever. That's straight out of Genesis chapter 21, verse 23. When the covenant was made, swear that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, etc. 3 generations referred to. There's a clear indication that what happened in Genesis 21 was the conversion of the Gentiles to the truth. We're going to meet Abimelech, king of the Philistines, at the judgment seat. And you'll have a man alongside of him called Phicol, the mouth of all. That's a digression, okay? Just to show you the importance of Beersheba in relation to the events that we're considering in 1 Chronicles 21, to which we can return. So what does David do here? Well, in verse 28 we read that he made sacrifice on Moriah, on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. But then he does something else. Look at chapter 22 and verses 1 and 2. 1 Chronicles 22, verse 1. Then David said, This is the house of Yahweh Elohim, and this is the altar of the burnt offering for Israel. So what's the this refer to? Well, to the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, isn't it? So he says this threshing floor is going to be where the house of God will be built. And this is where the altar of the burnt offering for Israel will be established. And from then on he offered sacrifice there. And then what does he do? Look at verse 2. And David commanded to gather together the strangers that were in the land of Israel. In other words, he gathers the Gentiles who had been left out of the numbering. Get a picture? So he straight away corrects himself. He says, I get it. I get it. We lost 70,000 Israelites, the number that stands for the family of the nations, because I did not incorporate the Gentiles in the numbering. I get it. And the angel, who should have done the 3 full days of divine judgment, stopped short. And he stopped short because the angel did not want to kill Ornan and his 4 sons, who were Gentiles. That's why the judgment was stopped short. So David is taught what he already knew. Now, I want to just step this up a little bit. You ready for this? I'm going to elevate this a bit, because you see something remarkable happens here. We're going to see. Now, that passage I quoted to you in 2 Chronicles 3 verse 1 is on the screen again. Then Solomon began to build the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where Yahweh appeared unto David his father, in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now, Moriah is a fascinating name. It means seen of Yah. It consists of 2 Hebrew words. One is obvious, Yah. That's, the contraction of the divine name. The other one is Ra'ah, R-A-A-H. And it simply means to see, or to be seen. So Moriah means to be seen of Yah. Now, the margin of this passage in the Oxford Bible is quite good, because it says this of that phrase in the yellow there. Now, as I pointed out, the Lord is in italics, it's not in the text. So here we've got a reference to Mount Moriah, which was seen of David, his father. So David saw Moriah as the place of sacrifice. That's what it's telling us. Okay? And he was reminded of Genesis 21 and 22. And we know what Genesis 22 is all about. It's about Abraham taking up Isaac to sacrifice him. And we've pointed out the importance of Beersheba in relation to that. Number Israel from Beersheba to Dan. Beersheba, Abraham made a covenant with the Philistines, and they were left out of David's numbering. And the project, as we pointed out, ended in judgment. And as we saw, Ishmael and Hagar were banished, representing the setting aside of the Mosaic order. Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech, king of the Philistines. He offers up Isaac as a type of God and Christ in the act of sacrifice. And the covenant was made unconditional because he had offered up his only beloved son. In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, says Genesis 22 and verse 17. And Abraham receives news of his family in Gentile lands at the end of Genesis 22. Because you see, Genesis 22, about the sacrifice of Christ, ends with a report that he gets from Haran that his relations, particularly his uncle, had brought forth 12 sons, the Israel of God in foreign lands. That's how Genesis 22 ends. So there's no doubt, is there, that God had always intended to incorporate the Gentiles. Now I want you, if you can, to compare with me what happens in Genesis 22 and 1 Chronicles 21. Now, you know these two. You know Genesis 22 very well, brothers and sisters, so we don't necessarily have to have it open, but if you wanted to have it open, these 2 chapters, you can actually compare what happens here. In Genesis 22, we know that God tested Abraham. The King James uses the word tempted. It means in the Hebrew tested. He tested Abraham by asking him to take up Isaac and offer him up as a burnt offering. In verse 1 of 1 Chronicles 21, David was tested. In verse 2 of Genesis 22, the journey of Abraham and Isaac and their 2 young men who went with them, representing Jew and Gentile by the way, was from Beersheba. In 1 Chronicles 21, the numbering was from Beersheba to Dan. In Genesis 22, it took them 3 days to get from Beersheba to Moriah. in 1 Chronicles 21, between verses 12 and 15, the angel destroyed for 3 days. Do you think there might be some comparisons to be made here? In Genesis 22, God says to Abraham, "Stay now thine hand." What did we read in 1 Chronicles 21 and verse 15? Well, it says this: "And God sent an angel unto Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was destroying, Yahweh beheld." You got one guess as to what that word is in the Hebrew. Raya. Yeah, it's Raya. Yahweh saw, and he repented him of the evil, and said to the angel that destroyed, "It is enough. Stay now thine hand." The exact words of Genesis 22 verse 12. In Genesis 22 verse 2, we had Abraham going to one of the hills in the land of Moriah, which means seen of Yah. Well, guess who's seen here on Moriah? In verse 15, it's Ornan the Jebusite. And the angel of Yahweh stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, who was seen of Yah. And that's where the judgment stopped. In Genesis 22 verses 13 and 14, Abraham sees Yah. We'll come back to that passage in a minute. And in 1 Chronicles 21 verses 16 and 28, David sees Yahweh. In verse 16 we read, "And David lifted up his eyes and saw the angel of Yahweh stand between the earth and the heaven, having a drawn sword in his hand, stretched out over Jerusalem." And in verse 28 we were reminded, "At that time when David saw that Yahweh had answered him in the threshing floor." So David sees. In Genesis 22 verse 2, Isaac was to be made a burnt offering. And in verse 26 of 1 Chronicles 21, David offers up burnt offerings and peace offerings and called upon Yahweh. In Genesis 22 verse 15, the angel spoke from heaven. And in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 26, the answer comes from heaven. In Genesis 22 verse 18, all nations are to be blessed in Abraham and his seed. And in 1 Chronicles 22 verse 2, David gathers the Gentiles who had been left out of the numbering to be involved in the building of the temple. In Genesis 22 verse 19, Abraham and Isaac and the 2 young men returned to Beersheba. And thankfully, brothers and sisters, in 1 Chronicles 21 and 22, David returns to the Gentiles. Now see how that unfolds? It's amazing, isn't it, when you see the comparison between these 2 sections of Scripture, just how meaningful they are. And there's one thing we need to mention, because I want you to come back to Genesis 22 with me. Because this name Moriah that we've been considering is changed around a little bit. Moriah consists of those 2 Hebrew words, Raya and Yah. It means to be seen of Yah. But have a look how it's renamed in verse 14. When Abraham, of course, has now made the offering up of the ram, the head of the flock, who had been caught in the thicket by his horns, clearly a type of Christ, we read in verse 14 that he renames the place. And Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh. Now you know what Yahweh Yireh is? It's the same 2 Hebrew words, Raya and Yah. It's just around the other way. They're switched around. So the meaning goes from being seen of Yah to what we now read at the end of verse 14. In the mount of Yahweh, and I'll give you the literal translation of the way this should read. On the mount of Yahweh, he will be seen. Who will be seen? Yahweh, with his Son, in this very same place. That's, brothers and sisters, what happened when David's vision of the things to come, when he took the head of Goliath and deposited it in this place, he knew that the sacrifice of Christ would be made here, that Yahweh would go forth with his Son and be seen on that mountain. Just like Abraham was seen on that mountain with his son. Now when you come to 1 Chronicles 21, what have you got? You've got the angel of Yahweh standing at the threshing floor of a faithful Gentile, and his hand is stayed. Yeah, Yahweh's being seen again in that place. Ornan is described as a king in 2 Samuel 24 verse 23. That's how he's described. In Young's literal translation of that verse, let's have a look at that. 2 Samuel 24 verse 23. So in verse 23 of this 24th chapter of 2 Samuel, we read all these things that Araunah, see the word as in the King James is in italics. You can safely cross it out. It's not there in the text. All these things did Araunah, a king, give unto the king. Well, hang on, where did he come from? Young's literal says, the whole hath Araunah given as a king to a king. Really? Well, where did he come from, do you think? Well, possibly he's a descendant of Melchizedek, because there was a line of kings in this place. It's quite possible he was a descendant of Melchizedek. You know, the people who ruled from this city thought they were descendants of Melchizedek. There's one in Joshua chapter 10 verse 1. He calls himself Adonai Zedek, the Lord of righteousness. In that chapter, by the way, is a type of the papacy, but we won't go into that now. But you see, they called themselves after the previous king, Melchizedek, when they were in this place. It's quite possible this man was a descendant of Melchizedek. He had 4 sons. You know, just like the 4 square encampment of Israel, the perfect cube of the most holy place, the number that God uses of his righteousness, of true spiritual Israel. So what we had in Genesis 22, when we saw Abraham and Isaac seen of Yahweh on that mountain, setting forth the sacrifice of Christ that was to come, David understood that. We saw in 1 Chronicles 21, the angel and Ornan in the same position. And in Matthew chapter 3 verse 17, what do you see? You see a father and a son going forth, as it were, to that same mountain. So brothers and sisters, what we have here are some marvellous things in relation to the Tabernacle of David. But in our next study, God willing, tomorrow morning, we're going to have a look at how the Tabernacle of David resolves the problem that was considered at the Jerusalem Conference. And the Jerusalem Conference was all about whether or not the Gentiles should be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And had that gone another way, brothers and sisters, you and I would not be sitting here as Christadelphians today. Had it been different, a different outcome, we would not have the truth today, because the Gentiles would have been commanded to be circumcised and to keep the law. You know where that would have ended up. So this is why this Tabernacle of David is so important. You know what resolved the Jerusalem Conference in Acts 15? It wasn't resolved by personal testimonies. It wasn't resolved by hours and hours of debate and argument. It was resolved by one phrase. One single phrase from the mouth of James, the Lord's half brother. And that phrase was the Tabernacle of David. That resolved it. So that's how important this subject is to you and me. But that's another subject for tomorrow. But let's just introduce it by making this comment. In Acts chapter 7, in Stephen's testimony, he makes this statement, but Solomon built him a house. Now Solomon did involve the Gentiles in the building of his house. I want you to come to 2 Chronicles chapter 2, because there's something I need to point out to you here. 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. So Solomon's setting out to prepare materials for the temple, to get this project underway. And look at verse 17 of the 2nd chapter. And Solomon numbered all the strangers that were in the land of Israel. So he does a numbering. After the numbering wherewith David his father had numbered them. Now, Brother Dwayne, you have the RSV in front of you, do you not? Can you just read out the first 4 or 5 lines of that verse, please?
What verse?
Verse 17 of the 2nd of Chronicles chapter 2. He's not even there. Well, I can tell you what it says, okay? But he's going to get there. We want to hear this. Verse 17, 2nd Chronicles 2.
He placed forces in all the fortified cities of Judah.
No, that can't be the one. You in 2nd Chronicles chapter 2? Or you in 1st Chronicles? He didn't know this was coming. I didn't forewarn him.
I was writing your notes.
Okay. That's a good excuse.
2:17. Then Solomon took a census of all the aliens who were in the land of Israel, after the census of them which David his father had taken.
Yeah, doesn't say them, does it? You see, when you read the King James Version, you are inclined to feel that David did include the Gentiles. But look at different translations. The word them is not there. See, it's telling us that Solomon took a census of the Gentiles after David's numbering. And David did not number the Gentiles. He left them out. See? And so now Solomon carries on and says, well, I need to know. Because I'm going to use these Gentiles in the building of the temple. Just like my father gathered them together after he'd made a mistake. He gathered them together and they got the materials prepared, etc. I'm now going to use them in my project. Guess how many he had, brothers and sisters? Look at the end of verse 17. And they were found 150,000 and 3,600. That's 153,600 male Gentiles in Israel. That's why David took the ark and put it in the tent in Jerusalem, so that those Gentiles could worship Yahweh without the hindrance of the law, and many of them were uncircumcised. We're going to see that come out in our study tomorrow morning, God willing. In Acts 7 verses 45 to 48 we read this. This is an introduction to tomorrow's study. David desired to find a tabernacle for the God of Jacob, it says. But Solomon built him an house. Howbeit, the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands. What does that suggest to you? It suggests to me that when Solomon built his temple, eventually that temple became a barrier to the Gentiles. And when Christ came on the scene, guess what they had done? Not only did they fill up the court of the Gentiles with the tables of the money changers and the animals that were bought and sold for sacrifice. Not only had they done that, brothers and sisters, they'd put a sign on the wall between the Jewish section of the court and the Gentile section of the court, and it said this: Gentiles, you come past this point on the pain of death. And you know what the apostle calls that in Ephesians chapter 2? The middle wall of partition. In other words, the Gentiles were excluded. That's why it says, but Solomon built him an house. It ultimately reversed what David had done to include the Gentiles in the purpose of God. It restored the Mosaic system in its totality, and that left the Gentiles out. So God willing, in our next study, we're going to have a look at how the Tabernacle of David resolved the Jerusalem conference.